October 1949, victory celebrations in Beijing. Over 30 years after the Soviet Revolution, communism makes a second great advance. The country with the largest population in the world now has a communist government. Photographer Hu Bo is on the platform.
The square was full of excited people chanting, "Long live Chairman Mao." But there was really only one thing on my mind, and that was to capture those precious moments with my camera and leave them to future generations.
留给当时不能参加天安门的人看。
It was a special day for China. After thousands of years of struggle, we were liberated at last. What a joy.
The crowds in Tiananmen Square hear Mao Zedong proclaim a new start. Mao says China will now be free of inequality, poverty, and foreign domination. From now on, 1/5 of the world's people will become part of the greatest experiment in mass mobilization ever attempted. They will be told to work, live, and think in a new way. As they attempt the leap to Mao's vision of a new society, millions will suffer or die, but their lives will be transformed.
So we're talking about China. China's kind of been in the news lately, hasn't it? And so you're going to learn a little bit about the history of how China became what it is. So we're actually going to start here before World War I. I told you a little bit about some of these things. Before World War II, excuse me. I told you a little bit about some of these things before, but we're going to get a little bit more specific about China. So after World War I, China, the Imperial China ended right before World War I. And it went through a great phase of conflict within China, but also transition. So it became a republic, but there was a lot of conflict within China, and there wasn't one accepted government in the whole area, in the whole country. With the emergence of this guy, very importantly, his name was Chiang Kai-shek. That's him in the picture. Now, it would have been interesting had he emerged as the eventual winner of the Chinese Civil War. The world would be a different place. Who knows what it would be like exactly, but it's not what happened. But it certainly looked like he would emerge as the winner of the war during this period. He led what was usually called the nationalist government, at least in English. And the capital of this government at the time was Nanking in China. His base of power, he controlled most of the army, was loyal to him. They had the Nationalist Party, which was the most significant political party in the post-imperial China, and a lot of the government. So again, it seemed that he would be the guy to come to power, to control China, and maybe implement through his leadership, not just him alone, but through his leadership, some type of republic. And that seemed to be what was happening. However, he had competition in different forms, but the biggest competition he had was from a man named Mao Zedong. He was the leader of the Communist Party in China, and we'll call it the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And because of what happens, he becomes very significant. But in 1934, he did have the support of Stalin from the Soviet Union at the time. Although Stalin was always very wary of things going on in China. Stalin was most concerned about with Japan at the time, right? And wanting China as a place that would offset Japan's power. But there was essentially a civil war that emerged between the nationalist side and the communist side in the 1930s. Now, talking about Japan. We talked about Japan before, right? Japan emerged as this very powerful country in the early 20th century. Japan was the earliest Asian country to really industrialize in a big way. They developed a strong navy and strong military, and by the early 1930s, they were the dominant power in East Asia. And look at the map here. So here you have, remember, the USSR actually borders on China and Japan. So this is the Soviet Union, Russia. Okay, today it'd be Russia. So Japan had control of the Korean Peninsula already. So everything in red there was part of Japan's, under Japan's power. In 1931, they took control of this area known as Manchuria, which was part of China technically. They took control of Manchuria, so that was very significant. In 1937, Japan attacked the rest of China. Okay? And this is really the beginning of what would become World War II in Asia. So Japan attacks China. The United States condemned this act. Britain condemned it. So a lot of people saw it as an aggressive war and condemned Japan for it, okay? But that didn't matter. They didn't go to war over it. But Japan attacks China. The army of Japan takes control of most of Western China. And this is part of Japan's expansion into the greater East Asian Empire. Infamous event known as the Nanking Massacre. That's a photograph from that event. We talked before about total war and the bombing of cities and civilians. Well, that's what happened in Nanking. Nanking was destroyed. Much of it, the Japanese took it over. They actually raped and pillaged people there. They killed probably 1 million people there. I'd have to look up the number, but it was bad, and it was a massacre. And that's actually from that event, the picture you see there. So this map kind of shows you what Japan did. They took over a pretty large area in Western China. A lot of the populated area. There's Nanking, by the way. There's Peking, or modern-day Beijing. Okay. Notice on the map you see on December 7th, 1941, not only did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines, which had an American army at the time. So their bid, the Japanese were trying to take control of essentially all of East Asia, and they also took control of French Indochina at that time in World War II. Okay? But they were not able to gain all of China. You can see the Soviets did help the Chinese to some extent. In fact, they helped both sides in China. When Japan invaded in 1937, the nationalists and the communists agreed not to fight each other. And they said, we'll both resist the Japanese. And that's what happened during the war. So, I'm not going to go through World War II again. We know what happened. Eventually, the United States, for the most part, defeats Japan. We talked about that. That will be on your final exam, too. The United States defeats Japan, and that also means that China wins. Ultimately, China technically was a United States ally in that sense. The United States always recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government as the legitimate government. And, of course, later the Soviet Union will recognize Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong's government. Well, the Civil War started again after World War II. And while it certainly seemed before World War II the nationalists were more powerful, after World War II, the communists gained the advantage. They were able to convince the majority of the population, who were, many of them poor peasants, that they were better for them. And it makes sense why, right? They promised a better life, workers' paradise, etc., etc. So Mao Zedong wins, as we saw in the video there. He proclaimed the new China. I think it was early October 1949. Okay, that's the founding of what is called the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek fled China with many of his supporters to the island of what we call today Taiwan. And they kept their nationalist Chinese government there. And both sides claim to be the legitimate government of China. But of course, what's come out of this since 1949 is you have mainland China, right? And you have Taiwan as a separate country. There's still debates about that today, and we won't get into that too much, but obviously you can see why it would cause issues in the world today. Well, this is the origin of those issues. And that's Mao Zedong in the picture there. So there again is China. The most populated areas of China are in China's east and along the coast. These are where the big cities are. But as you know, China is a very populated area. Traditional ancient China was in this area in the east. But China controls a very large territory and bordered on Russia. And these would have been part of the Soviet Union during the time period we're talking about. So the Soviet Union actually went to border here. There's Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. This is Tibet over here. So you can see how large China is. Pretty significant. The Koreas. North Korea came about. Well, we talked about the Korea before, right? China supported the North Koreans in the Korean War, right? So, what happened? This is the People's Republic of China. China became, like what happened in the Soviet Union and other countries where communist revolutions succeed, a one-party communist state. Okay? And Mao Zedong was the leader of that state until his death. So we're going to be talking basically about Mao's rule until his death. He definitely had Soviet support. There's no doubt about that, okay? The Soviets supported Mao, although there will be conflicts with the Soviets later, but they did help him succeed initially and gave money to them. Mao set about doing the same thing that Stalin did in the Soviet Union and that other Soviet leaders did. While early on, he promised the peasants land, which he did. They did give the peasants land in the early 50s to some extent. They did these show trial type things. We'll have a picture that I'll talk about here in a second. Well, they did these, they had the peasants denounce the landowners and gave them land and so forth. But, as we've seen this picture before, they were never going to let all these people own private property. That was part of the land distribution scheme, though, right? Redistribution scheme. Over time, then they started collectivizing the land too. Because remember, private property is a no-no in communist theory and in communist states. So they start a process of collectivization similar to what we saw in the Soviet Union. There wasn't quite as much resistance by peasants, although there were many people who were killed or done away with or put in prison because they resisted collectivization, or they did not go along initially with the states taking over of all industry in China. Now, you might have heard the term brainwashing before. You've heard that term, right? Brainwashing. Brainwashing conjures up for us the idea of not just convincing someone that your ways of doing things or your ideas are the best, but of actually almost hypnotizing people into what you want them to do, where they become intellectual zombies. That would be a way to describe it. Well, that term actually goes back to the People's Republic of China. They use the term, we're going to brainwash the intellectuals, basically force them through propaganda and sometimes by violence to believe what we want. Now here's a trial of the landlord. This is what they did to expose the owners of private property. And I'll end this video here.